Thank all of you for your work and for what you're continuing to do to keep our nation safe. We appreciate that very much. You are carrying out the law and what you've been asked to do, and there are a lot of families across the country that are incredibly grateful for the work that you do in that. Look, I'm going to get a couple of definitions here. The number has come up over 90,000 family apprehensions. Is that 90,000 individuals total, or is that 90,000 families, not families, but we don't know what the number is within that family? Let's do a clarification there.
Thank you, Senator. Actually, for this fiscal year, CBP apprehensions both at the ports of entry and between the ports of entry through August is now over 130,000 family units, and that is actual individuals that make up.
So 130,000 individuals that came as a family unit coming through.
Yes, Senator.
Do we know how many actual families that is? So does that represent 75,000 families or groups of individuals, or you just have a number that's broken up 130,000?
It's more typically broken out in the manner which I just mentioned, but we can get back to you on that,
Okay,
Senator.
that's fine. How do you determine family relationship there? As you've already mentioned before in your prior testimony, there are adults that are coming across the border carrying a child with them or bringing a child with them so they can say they're a family unit. How are you determining who is a family unit and who is not?
Well, thank you, Senator. We're using every resource at our disposal. So not only our biographic and biometric databases, our interviews with the actual families themselves. If they are not carrying documents, we will reach into the consulate contacts that we have also, our colleagues throughout the law enforcement community, and again, leaning on the behavioral analysis and skills of our frontline agents and officers to make those determinations, ultimately, whether or not the family unit is in fact, or the parentage that's being claimed is in fact a valid one.
Do you have to resort to DNA testing at times to be able to determine that?
We don't do DNA testing at the border, sir.
So is there an additional penalty for an adult bringing a child with them, claiming to be a family member, but then you determine this is not actually a family member, this is them trying to be released in the country? Is there any additional consequence for that individual adult?
Well, typically, yes, Senator. So if we find that fraudulent claim be made, then we will refer that individual for potential prosecution, as well as, of course, take great care, as I mentioned earlier, of the safety and well-being of the child.
Because at that point, that child's being trafficked or that child's being used by the adult for whatever purpose to be able to try to get across the border early. Then we've got to actually try to find their family.
And those are the determinations that, again, uniquely case by case that were subsequently made and that are investigated. So whether or not it was a trafficking organization that was simply trying, to gain profit, as many of them will do, in marketing themselves to these migrants to take this very dangerous journey, or whether or not it is a serious and or more, alarming case at times of human trafficking, those are subsequently then investigated both by ourselves and our colleagues at ICE to make those determinations. And then, again, as you asked, determine what end state and or disposition we will collectively have with the individual that's found to be, perpetuating these illicit acts.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the ongoing work that y'all are doing all the time in that for those kids and those families. We talked about push and pull factors some today. Over the last 3 years, the United States Congress has allocated about $650 million in economic assistance for the Northern Triangle, for economic investment there to be able to increase jobs, for anti-corruption efforts, for criminal justice efforts to try to help reduce the crime rate. The murder rate has dropped some in the Northern Triangle. There has been some economic development that's there, but we have made tremendous investments of around $650 million a year each year into the Northern Triangle to be able to help them have a more stable environment that people aren't having to flee. At the same time, I'm concerned about the pull factor here because most of the children that are coming as unaccompanied minors and many of the individuals that are coming as family units are coming because there's a family member already here. Is it our policy currently, if there is a family member already present in the United States, even if they're not legally present in the United States, that unaccompanied minor can be placed with someone not legally present in the United States?
Those determinations are made by HHS, but I can tell you that the policy of that agency is the immigration status of the sponsor is not relevant to their determination as to whether or not a child can be placed in that household, which from our data that we've seen just recently, you're looking at close to 80% of the people that are sponsors or household members within these residences are illegally here in the country.
So that has not always been so. If you go back 15, 20 years ago, if someone came into the country illegally as a child, they were not placed in a home of someone who was also didn't have legal status in the United States. The sponsor had to be someone who had legal status or was a United States citizen if you go back in time. So my question is that a reasonable standard to be able to have and to be able to go back to is that we do not have sponsors that do not have legal presence in the United States?
You're getting me way out of my lane here, because that's really an HHS decision. I wouldn't want to weigh in on to how they manage their resources.
Mr. Perez, what effect do you think that would have on the pull factor?
Thank you, Senator. I think, from CBP's perspective, pecking away at any of the potential pull factors that we're seeing that create this spike of movement, one that is, again, wrought with danger, wrought with exploitation, wrought with abuse and abandonment at times, is something that we're interested in seeing. Again, as Mr. Albin suggests, it really is HHS to answer, in depth the question that you're posing. But I think a very important point that I'd like to make from the CBP perspective is that in my opening I talked of the complexity that oftentimes I think gets overlooked of what it is being done at the front line of the border. The national security mission, the trade and travel mission, the drug interdiction mission, the trade enforcement mission, all critical missions that are taxed, if you will, by the surge in migrants.
Mr. Chairman, there seems to be some very obvious things that we can do. Senator McCaskill has brought up again the judges. You've brought up the judges and expanding the number of judges. I think it's something that we really need to continue to be able to press in on and to say we've got to have a faster adjudication and due process than 2 years, 2.5 years. One of the issues that we've got to address is this issue about sponsorship. We tend to, quote unquote, lose children when they go and are placed in a home with someone who's already not legally present, who's been living under the radar for years, and then we're surprised when they both disappear. That shouldn't surprise us. That is something, if we're going to take care of children, we've got to find a way to be able to take care of children and not put them in the home of someone who's not legally present here. But that also discourages people from saying, you're 14 years old, your dad is already in the United States working, it's time for you to go join them, and encourage that activity and that connection point. And the last thing we haven't talked about is the licensing of the facilities. And I'd like to be able to do some follow-up on that because the Flores Agreement requires a licensed facility, but that has been quite a barrier to actually get licensed facilities from a state for a family facility. And I think it's created an artificial barrier for us. And I'd like to be able to follow up on those in the days ahead.